I'm Thomas Carruthers, Interim President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today. We're here to discuss inequality in institutions in South Africa. There's hardly a more relevant topic for democracies today than the quest for inclusive growth and the tensions that often arise between the search to overcome inequality and the struggle to maintain institutional coherence and legitimacy. South Africa is important both because of the importance of the case itself, South Africa's place in the region, its importance as a country, but also because it's a country to which many others look for lessons, particularly on these issues. The study that we're going to be discussing is a paper by a group of researchers at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And it's a product of an informal research partnership that Carnegie and the Mandela School have had over the last several years, looking at political governance in a number of African countries. We also have a terrific study on political governance in Zambia that will be coming out soon. And some researchers at the Mandela School also did an excellent study of issues related in Zimbabwe on some related topics. Our host today, or our moderator, is going to be Zainab Usman. Zainab is the new director of Carnegie's, or the director of a new program at Carnegie on Africa. First time in a long time that we've had a dedicated program on Africa. Overdue. We're very excited about it and very excited to have Zainab with us. She comes to Carnegie from via the World Bank, where she previously worked, and before that, Oxford University. She's a Nigerian political economist, and the program we'll be doing at Carnegie will have a strong political economy focus. Before I turn it over to Zainab, I'm delighted to have Faisal Ismail, the director of the Mandela School, with us, who's going to offer a few words of welcome as well. Faisal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom Carruthers. As you've said, my name is Faisal Ismail, and I'm the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. It's such a pleasure to join you and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in launching this research paper on the state of South Africa's democracy. Indeed, all the researchers of this paper are from the University of Cape Town and the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. I assumed the directorship of the school about 2 years ago, and I'm privileged to be building on the outstanding work of Ellen Hirsch, the former director, and Brian Levy, the former academic director of the school, who built the foundations of the school. The Mandela School has been offering a part-time master's course on development policy and practice for the past 7 years. And this year, for the first time, we've launched our full-time MPhil program. I'm teaching a course on global governance and trade, and Carlos Lopez, our esteemed colleague, has started teaching a course in the school on transformative industrialization in Africa. Our school is focused on 3 thematic areas: democratic governance and active citizenship, sustainable development and regional integration in Africa, and implementation of public policies and programs. Last year, we hosted a webinar series on the African Continental Free Trade Area and regional value chains in Africa, and engaged the Secretary General, Wamkele Mene, on how the Trade Integration Project can support industrialization in Africa and how the gains of trade can be extended to the smaller and poorer countries as well. This year, we are launching a webinar series on implementation, focusing on challenges of both governance and implementation of public policies. Our purpose is to bring together Africa's academics, policymakers, and intellectuals, together with its civil society actors and other stakeholders, in a dialogue about democratic governance and development in Africa. The launch of this paper is timeless, and it will contribute to the debate of our webinar series. So I'm very thankful to you for offering to host this paper at this time, together with the Nelson Mandela School. And we hope to engage with many of the listeners and institutions who have joined this program today in the coming weeks and months. Thank you so much, and over to you, Zainab Usman.
Thank you very much, Tom and Faisal. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Zainab Usman. As Tom mentioned, I'm the director of the New Africa program here at the Carnegie Endowment. So at the Carnegie Africa program, our focus is on the economic, the political, and the transnational issues that are shaping Africa today, and that will have relevance for the continent's future trajectory. Therefore, we are examining trends in entrepreneurship on the continent, in energy transition and climate change, in the changing investment landscape, in technology, and also we're looking at the changing nature of trade relations between African countries and their external partners. Most recently, we've done some work on looking at how the geopolitics of COVID-19 vaccine distribution could shape decisively Africa's post-pandemic economic recovery, as well as the continent's external relations with its partners. This analysis is available on our website, and we've also had a discussion with the Africa CDC, as well as representatives of the European Union in collaboration with our colleagues at Carnegie Europe. This is also available on our website. So you can sign up to our newsletter to stay up to date with our activities and remain engaged. It's really a pleasure to have this discussion on South Africa, which is one of the continent's most important regional powers and anchor economies. The report itself is, again, available on the Carnegie website. And, for now, I'm going to hand over to Brian Levy, Vinathan Naidu, Musa Nzele, hope I pronounced that correctly, who will lead with the presentation. And then their colleague, Alan Hirsch, is going to handle the Q&A session. So without further ado, Brian, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Zainab. First slide, please. South Africa's 1994 transition, its first democratic election and the swearing in of Nelson Mandela as president was one of the most inspiring episodes of the hopeful 1990s. This talk, though, is not about that moment, but it's about what came after. Next slide, please. The talk is the story of a collision between unusually strong institutions and unusually extreme inequality. It is a story from which many countries can learn. Next slide, please. Let's begin with institutions. As this slide signals, as of 1996, 2 years after the democratic election, South Africa's public institutions were remarkably strong. If you look at its percentile rank using worldwide governance indicators, it ranked the 83rd percentile worldwide on government effectiveness, and it ranked the 76th percentile worldwide in the control of corruption. Its institutional quality was more that of a high-income country than a middle-income country. Even though, next slide, please, even though, in fact, as you see in the top row here, South Africa is a middle-income country. As of the early 2000s, its per capita income was similar to that of Brazil, and it was below that of Mexico. But however, as you also see on the slide, usually when one talks about inequality in middle-income countries, Brazil is regarded as the most unequal middle-income country as of the early 2000s. In fact, though, as you see, South Africa turns out to be way more unequal. The top 15% of the population accounted for almost 68% of spending in South Africa, but under 57% in 2002 Brazil, and the bottom 40% by contrast accounted for slightly more than 8% in Brazil, but only 5.5% in South Africa. So how do institutions and inequality interact? This brings me, in the next 3 slides, to the core analytic framework we use in the paper. Next slide, please. Those of us who were filled with optimism by South Africa's democratic miracle had in mind the possibility that's depicted on the left-hand side of this figure. As you see in this figure, a combination of hopeful ideas and strong institutions fuel growth and set in motion a virtuous cycle of development. But what this does not reckon with, but is central to our framework, is the way in which this hopeful scenario can be confounded by inequality, or to be more precise, can be confounded by imbalances between the distribution of political power and the distribution of economic power. To see the magnitude of this challenge, consider South Africa's political settlement. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the settlement in terms of 5 distinct deals. Some of these deals were reasonably straightforward. The commitment to equal formal rights before the law, the promise to reduce extreme poverty, the commitment to rebalance political power, the ideational commitment to cooperate, to focus on win-win possibilities. But other aspects of this deal, of this settlement, were much more difficult. As we'll see, the delivering on the promise of upward mobility turned out to be challenging. So was the promise of elite Black economic empowerment. And another difficult challenge was the internal commitment within the ANC to align its broad tent around a shared national purpose. Or to make the point differently, drawing on work in the 1970s by Albert Hirschman, who was exploring the changing tolerance for inequality in Latin America, these deals were more in the nature of aspirations than shared commitments. So next slide, please. So this actually, Hirschman, in fact, he posited a cycle of change. He posited a cycle of change along these lines, a period of growth and hope, followed by, with the changing tolerance for imbalances, a period of anger, and then hopefully the possibility of renewal. We organize our paper around this threefold cycle, and to begin with the first, the period of hope. Next slide, please. This period of season of hope in South Africa, in a sense, was a period in which South Africa largely enjoyed the happy possibility laid out in the earlier figures. This is a period that was characterized by a central idea, the idea of the possibility of gains from cooperation. In focusing, as we will, on South Africa's challenges, it is easy to forget the economic gains that were achieved, but they were substantial. Next slide, please. Between 1996 and 2011, the country achieved major gains in reducing extreme poverty. The percentage of the population that went to bed hungry at night, in extreme poverty with daily hunger, declined from 28% in 1996 to 11% in 2011. There was a major expansion of infrastructure and of social services. Also, next slide, please. Also, the economy, which by the late 1980s into the early 1990s had stalled, began to grow. And by the mid-2000s, economic growth had reached 5% per annum. The trouble was, next slide, please, that even as this happened, inequality, the right-hand side of that earlier figure, equality remained unaddressed. There were deep-seated, unresolved distributional imbalances. Next slide, please. Take 2 points from this slide. First, just to notice the distribution of the population. The distribution of the population, overwhelmingly Black South Africans. Second, I want you to notice the schema at the bottom of this slide, which organizes that population into 3 different socioeconomic groups, ranging from chronically poor to middle class and the elite, with a transient poor and a vulnerable category in between. To give you some headlines from this, next slide, please. Here are 3. If we look at the population that is poor, including transient, it accounted for 62% of the population, of whom 57 of the 62 are Black South Africans, and they account for only 13% of spending. The solidly middle class accounts for only 20% of the population, about half Black South Africans, and they account for 37% of spending. The elite accounts for 3.5% of the population, of which 2.5% are white, and they account for 35% of total spending. That number, by the way, if you were to contrast it with the USA, where we talk about inequality, that elite equivalent would be closer to 20 to 25% by comparison. So this is an extreme example. What were the consequences of these unresolved inequalities? I'm going to end this part of my presentation by highlighting three. Next slide, please. First, I want to underscore the ways in which these aspirational parts of the political settlement increasingly look like unmet aspirations. And I flagged three here. The promise of upward mobility, an unmet aspiration. The promise of elite Black empowerment. Musa will have more to say on that, so you'll see that narrative. The ANC commitment to an intra-ANC resolution around a shared national purpose, increasingly difficult. And most broadly, the commitment to cooperation for win-win, as we will see unravel. So that's the first. Second slide, what happened to growth? Next slide, please. What happened to growth? In the 1910s, even as other middle-income countries recovered from the global financial crisis, South Africa stagnated. And then third, and this is to end and then to hand over to Musa. Next slide, please. The pressure that these unresolved distributional imbalances placed on institutions. And to discuss that, we'll turn in turn first to Vino Naidu and then to Musa. Over to you, Vino. Vino, you're on mute. Vino, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Brian. Thanks for the warning there. It's great to be with everyone. And I want to talk about the role that South Africa's public sector has played in the overall story that Brian has just sketched. And I want to highlight three key takeaways and one consequence. So the consequence is that South Africa's public sector has produced mixed and uneven performance, has experienced diminished capacity where guardrails have been weakened, but where the public sector hasn't become trapped in a precipitous decline. And so I will therefore also end with something of a prognosis. Next slide, please. So, South Africa's public sector matters to this story because the process of transforming the state bureaucracy has in practice generated competing and conflicting pressures. Next slide, please. Great. So on the one hand, one of the aims of public sector transformation was to retool and repurpose the public sector as a vehicle for translating ideational aims into concrete outcomes to tackle inequality. And on the other hand, the state bureaucracy has also served as a venue or a site of contestation between elites over access and control of resources. So this friction has disrupted the linearity of this process, undermined the credibility of ideational aims, and constrained the performance of the public sector. Next slide, please. So we can see how these pressures have hampered the South African public sector's performance by looking at a couple of indicators. So on staffing, there have been significant gains in racially transforming South Africa's public sector workforce, whilst containing aggregate personnel numbers over the long term. However, when you disaggregate the numbers, it shows significant growth in the middle and senior management ranks, which has crowded out opportunities to increase capacity amongst skilled frontline public servants like teachers, nurses, and local government technical personnel. And you can also see the effects of this on public service delivery, where despite engineering and impressive expansion in access to services, South Africa's public sector has shown considerable inconsistency in improving the delivery interface with citizens, on performance management, value for money, as well as adherence to process controls. And this is illustrated on the slide by some examples from key social and economic services and infrastructure. Next slide, please. So how has politics factored into all of this? Well, transformation has been a political double-edged sword, allowing a new political elite to more easily control the public sector, whilst facilitating interference in the recruitment and appointment of public servants by sanctioning a de facto policy of politicization through party processes. And here I'm referring to the ANC's policy of deploying party loyalists into the state. So the factionalization of deployment within the ANC, which was particularly pronounced during and in the aftermath of the Mbeki Zuma transition, has had an increasingly harmful impact on politicization by expanding opportunities for patronage amidst a growing managerial class, whilst creating instability and undermining professionalism in public sector leadership, becoming embroiled in contestation over service delivery contracts and deteriorating public finance practices, and contributing to an enlargement of the state machinery. Next slide, please. So what does the future hold for South Africa's public sector? Well, its mixed and uneven performance, coupled with restrained, if imbalanced, aggregate staffing trends, has produced an unsatisfactory, to be sure, but good enough level of performance in the context of the wider story told in the paper. We also think that the corrosive effects of political interference can be reversed, or at the very least arrested, as we have seen it ebb and flow in the transition between political leaders, and where it does not seem to conform to an inexorable slide. But what are the real or probable prospects for public sector renewal, rather than just possibilities? Last slide, please. So on the probabilities for public sector renewal, here we are more circumspect. Meaningful change won't happen overnight, given the size, scope, and complexity of the public sector, and where no one single intervention can act as a panacea. There are, however, a few things to look out for under the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa, which I've noted on this slide, and which I think will reveal how probable and sustainable public sector renewal is likely to be. So let me now hand over to Musa.
Thank you, Vino, and hello, everybody. Well, the weakening of functionality and capability also occurred in the private and public enterprise space. The structural inequality in 1994 set up a game of the elite, where South African economy was overrepresented by a few large businesses, and on the other hand, few politically prominent Black leaders. So this supported bargaining at the top. If we organize our thinking along three distinct decades of governance, as shown in the slide, we see three distinct phases of elite transformation. The first is the transition period, where established white business realized that political power is shifting, and for their own survival, they needed to proactively signal cooperation and build legitimacy by accommodating new entrants. They initiated Black empowerment deals with politically influential actors with the aim of facilitating. Oh, please change the slide. Sorry. Yes, we're on the first slide. So they initiated Black empowerment deals with politically influential actors with the aim of facilitating the creation of a few new Black-owned businesses, as well as transferring minority ownership. This certainly created a visible signal of cooperation, but unlike the public sector, there was no clear institutionalized path through which the new elite could occupy an influential role in the economy. The early ad hoc deals were desirable to be implemented broadly. As such, Cyril Ramaphosa led a BE commission in 1998, where it was decided that the ad hoc white-driven strategy must be codified into a coherent, systematic way of racially transforming the commanding heights of the South African economy. Next period, please. So the 2000s institutionalized the entrance of emerging Black elites through the Black Economic Empowerment Act and complementary sector-specific laws, such as the Mining Act. These would ideally provide predictability to the process of transformation, especially given the long queues of emerging aspirant elites. But in reality, rules cannot cover all possible future events that are crucial to the security of property rights, to government licenses, and to preferential state procurement. So businesses reverted to a practice of personalized, targeted deals, particularly in large industries. But who was chosen for deals to secure political protection? Indeed, the question became BEE for whom, not for what. The latter is impersonal, pointing to transformation and growth. The former is personal, depending on identities and proximity to dominant political factions. This ambiguity between rules and deals, coupled with the discovery that political clout could translate to financial returns without the need of productive capability, opened opportunities for erosion of BEE as a programmatic mechanism of broad-based private sector transformation. Overall, the opting of a few based on identities not only resulted in a narrow transformation, but a growing frustration of the excluded aspirant elites. Next period, please. The implosion of the ruling party along the factional lines from 2007 saw the rise of the excluded elite. Growth had taken a huge knock. The pipeline of BEE deals was extremely thin. So came the question, SOEs for whom, not for what? With their large procurement activity, SOEs became the next low-hanging fruit for accumulation for new entrants. The legitimate role of SOEs in supporting new and infant industries through preferential procurement was hijacked for politically motivated projects or service providers. The outcome was not broader accommodation of elites, but accommodation of a different faction. What were the sources of pressure on a seemingly good plan? I think the following questions might help. Did BEE set up an internal logic to create wealth? Were there requirements or mechanisms to build bricks and mortar productive enterprises? Was there an internal incentive to create these productive enterprises rather than consumerist equity transfers with no developmental requirements? Is there a possibility that building new enterprises leverages local culture and supports the identity of new elites and new ideas in ways that avoids inevitable racial baggage of sharing pre-existing businesses? Was there an overdependence on the state to create entrepreneurs, leaving the system vulnerable to formation of political capitalists or tenderpreneurs? And therefore, was there an internal logic that undermined political and corporate governance because benefiting elites had no incentive to challenge the governing party? Next slide, please. How do we evidence these patterns of institutional erosion of BEE and state-owned enterprises? Well, incredible work has been done in this area, as cited in our paper, so I'll be brief. The gist is that with no requirements for new fixed investments and enterprise, there was no expansion of transformation, even though there was an expansion of business registrations and deals. For example, my research in platinum mining shows that in anticipation of the mining policy of 2004, over 100 platinum mining domestic companies were registered between 2000 and 2009, with a significant share of them participating in BEE deals, yet almost all of them are now deregistered. These kinds of abuses have left a missing middle for productive small and medium enterprises and left no black capital to respond to the post-COVID-19 investment opportunities. Next, final slides, please. The erosion of the governance of public enterprise was not simply a post-2010 phenomenon. Questionable practices were already evident much earlier, as exemplified by the arms deal and Eskom scandals. So the 2010s already had a template of what was possible. An ethos of personal consumerism without delivering capability and productive value seemingly became structural and cultural, threatening to erode all institutional infrastructure. But South Africa has surprising strengths, where several groups have incentives to see growth, job creation, and functioning institutions, as Brian will detail. Brian, over to you.
Overall then, looking at both Vino's and Musa's presentations, we see the following aggregate trend. Between 1996 and 2017, the quality of South African governance indeed worsened. However, contrary to some catastrophizing narratives, even at the end of this period, the quality of South African governance was at the upper end compared with other middle-income countries. Of course, as I laid out earlier, our analysis focuses much more broadly than on institutions. Next slide, please. Which brings me to the last parts of our presentation, the role of ideas and the challenge of renewal. Next slide, please. As per our framework, inequality, unresolved distributional imbalances, did not only put pressure on institutions, it also, as per Albert Hirschman's work on Latin America, it also led to an ideational shift from hope to anger, adding to pressure for a downward spiral. Our paper highlights two aspects of this ideational shift. Next slide, please. The first aspect involved coming to grips with South Africa's ideational legacy and political legacy of institutionalized racism, the law of the land in South Africa right into the late 1980s. As became increasingly apparent, internalized privilege does not magically disappear with a constitutional settlement, and a reckoning with that privilege was at the root of the confrontation depicted in these photographs. Photographs of the Rhodes Must Fall movement that engulfed the University of Cape Town, shown in these pictures in 2015. I think I speak for all the authors when I say that we regard this reckoning as difficult but necessary. However, next slide, please. There was also a second aspect to the ideational shift, one brilliantly captured conceptually in recent work by our discussant Danny Roderick and his co-author Sharon Mukand. The manipulation of worldviews and identities by skillful political entrepreneurs working to shift political allegiances in their favor. This happened also in South Africa. Next slide, please. Here are two memes used by the Economic Freedom Fighters, a political party established in 2013. Each meme, white monopoly capital and expropriation without compensation, comprises an effort to shift both the worldview, why South Africa finds itself in the straits that it's in, and identity, locating the challenge squarely within whiteness and colonialism, in a way calculated to increase support for ethno-populism. And as the next slide shows, next slide please, as the next slide shows, between 2013 and 2017, both memes appeared with increasing frequency in the South African media. The country looked set for an ideas-driven acceleration of its downward spiral. However, as the bottom part of the slide shows, this isn't what happened. The use of both memes receded. Why? Next slide, please. Because South Africa's checks and balances institutions worked, that instead of Jacob Zuma's chosen successor, Cyril Ramaphosa became president. Now, how this happened is not the focus here. Rather, what I want to focus on to end our talk is what might come next and make a key point. Next slide, please. South Africa is not yet out of the woods. This slide in the paper highlights two different possible scenarios as to the way forward. As you can see, an ethno-populist scenario and an inclusive development scenario. No time to go into these scenarios in any depth, just want to make a few points about the scenarios. First, as you can see on the bottom row of this slide, the one scenario, the ethno-populist scenario, crashes the economy. The other one is the basis for expansion. However, next slide, please. Despite crashing the economy, the ethno-populist scenario is not irrational politically. As you see in this slide, a tiny elite, a very small elite, can do very well from it. And indeed, the majority of the Black population may be affected by that scenario only on the margins. However, next slide, please. We also posit a far more hopeful scenario, one with major gains, as per this slide, for the majority of the country's population. But here's the thing. It's easy to sit down and to write down encouraging numbers that look like this. The challenge is how to get there. And here, in the broadest terms, is our answer. What is needed are policy actions that work at both the conventional technical policy level and at the ideational level. And our final slides aim to give you some initial sense of how this might work. Next slide, please. This slide highlights the role of that ideational dimension. In the same way that a downward spiral on the left side can be driven by interaction between inequality and ideas, as I discussed, so can a virtuous circle be also driven by this interaction, shifting from disillusion and anger to a renewal of hope. How? Next slide, please. This slide highlights a strategy that we think, given South Africa's current circumstances, best combines a policy and an ideational focus, and that is a credible promise to accelerate upward mobility. Why upward mobility? Highlight now two main reasons. First, because it has been a weak spot in South Africa's post-1994 period, except for that brief time when the economy grew. And second, because it has the potential to renew hope and legitimacy more broadly. How to accelerate upward mobility? Here you see three aspects of the strategy: governance, strengthened ladders of opportunity, and growth-compatible redress. Next slide, please. This slide does two things. It provides some detail on each of these aspects, which I can't go through now, but happy to return to in questions and answers. In the team, we've done in-depth work on most of these aspects. Second, what the slide also does is it flags that the three aspects are mutually reinforcing. Improved governance supports the strengthening of ladders of opportunity. Governance and redress are mutually reinforcing. Without improved governance, redress will be perceived as punitive and predatory, and redress is also necessary both for governance renewal and for financing what's needed on the stronger ladders of opportunity. Finally, now I come to my final slide. Next slide, please. This slide highlights the four mutually reinforcing mechanisms that in our approach combine what I described as the technocratic policy and the ideational strategies, and thus that we believe are crucial to setting in motion a new virtuous spiral. First, as per the previous slide, you see a mutually reinforcing strategy to strengthen upward mobility. Second, insofar as that is successful, it strengthens legitimacy more broadly, and at the ideational level, helps renew a broader commitment to pursuing cooperative win-win outcomes. Third, moving to the bottom, a renewed commitment to cooperation can provide a platform, a credible platform for accelerated inclusive growth, which fourth can, in a virtuous spiral, cascade back into a further acceleration of upward mobility and a further strengthening of the virtuous spiral. And I will end there, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, Musa, and Vino. That was a very, very fascinating, very rich presentation. Before I hand over to our discussants, let me quickly summarize what I think I heard from the presentation itself. Probably four key things. The first is really the striking numbers around the distribution of poverty and inequality in South Africa. And of course, you know, the racial dimensions of that and, you know, the horizontal inequality there. And I also kept wondering, I guess one question for me is, where do the non-Black people of color fit into this equation? The second pillar of the presentation, I would say, is the, what we got on the public sector performance, that it is unsatisfactory, but it is good enough. And on that front, I also kept wondering how this compares with other African countries, especially, the lower middle income peer countries in Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and others. And also, actually, I kept thinking of the Middle East, the Gulf economies in particular, where they also have a very interesting public sector dynamics there that are meant to achieve socioeconomic objectives. The third key takeaway is around the Black economic empowerment programs, as well as the performance of state-owned enterprises, and how certain objectives around economic accumulation and elite formation have kind of morphed and transformed over time, such that other objectives around empowering micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises are sort of left hanging. And I also kept thinking about then the role of informality, given that the informal sector is not probably that large compared to other African economies, and also where the youth, young people, fit in here. And then finally, Brian's conclusion around ideas and options for renewal. So he highlighted the role of political entrepreneurs and also made mention of some of the narratives, populist narratives that the EFF have been able to craft over the years. And I kept thinking that perhaps this also reflects an absence of a new and updated and widely accepted national vision. And again, thinking about how this compares with other multi-ethnic, multinational countries across Africa, including Nigeria and Ethiopia, that are also struggling in various ways with social and national cohesion. And of course, then he outlined the 4 scenarios and pathways. So those were some of my key takeaways and questions that I kept thinking at the back of my mind. Now I'm going to introduce our discussants. So to begin with, we have Ms. Trudy Makaya, who is the economic advisor to President Cyril Ramaphosa. We also have Professor Danny Roderick, who's a professor of international political economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. We also have Alan Hirsch, who's one of the co-authors of the report, also at the Mandela School of Public Governance. So I hand over to, I think, Danny Roderick, who's going to start first. And Danny, you have around 10 minutes or so to give your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. It's good to be here. I think we owe the authors, Brian, Musa, Vino, and Alan, really a big debt of gratitude. This is really a phenomenal piece that does a lot of things and does them very well, provide the kind of synthetic narrative on South Africa since the transition. It provides a kind of a path forward, a kind of some sense of hope, and it's also it's cast in a way that's actually is comparative in some sense. I mean, bringing the frequent reference to Alan Hirschman and Latin America and other countries, I think puts it in a very sort of nicely comparative framework, although in many ways South Africa is really sui generis. It's very difficult to find another country to compare it to. I will mostly amplify and build on this I think great text. I guess I want to start by saying that perhaps the authors, at least from an outsider's perspective, underplay the success of South Africa in politics. I would sort of summarize South Africa's post-1994 experience actually as a great political success and an economic disappointment. I think I'm not saying economic failure because there are a lot of bright spots, but it's been an economic disappointment. But politically, I believe it's been an incredible success. And I think in two respects. One, of course, the transition. I don't need to tell anybody here sort of, how difficult the political transition in 1994 was, and what the general expectations about where South Africa would go after the transition, how pessimistic those were, not just on the economic front, that macroeconomic collapse and hyperinflation and fiscal irresponsibility, all those things would accompany the transition, but that South Africa would be unable to maintain a democracy where the Black majority had been essentially cut off from the productive economy and under the apartheid regime, and the explosion was going to happen. That liberal democracy really would be very impossible. I think for a very long time, the fact that South Africa could maintain its democracy and its the rule of law and the free media and an independent judiciary, I think this is an extraordinary success, not just for any middle-income country, for a country that was so divided and where inequalities were so large, both on income and racial and grounds. I think this is a very deep mystery to me in comparative context, but it's very important to underscore what a huge success it is. I think it's also quite remarkable on the political sphere that once the decline under Zuma set in, the decline in sort of the operations of the government institutions, the rising cronyism and corruption, the rise in ethnopopulism. To me, it's the second remarkable thing on the political dimension for South Africa is in fact how that decline was reversed, or at least paused, with the successful election of the current president, Ramaphosa. Again, in comparative perspective, it's really difficult to understate how important and significant that is, because if you look all around the world to the other middle-income countries that have sort of had extensive periods of authoritarianism, decline in authoritarianism, it's rather rare that once this decline, the authoritarian decline and the corruption of institutions go the way that they were going under the previous administration, that you can actually stop it. Yet in South Africa, as the authors explain, the media remained free. The public prosecutor's office did its job. The judicial institutions did their job. This is really, again, I think the whole political story to me is absolutely remarkable. Now, on economics, I think the economic disappointments, the inability to fundamentally alter inequalities and opportunities in South Africa is clearly the area, the big area of disappointment, and linking sort of what I'm going to say next to one of the key themes in the paper, I would say that disappointment here probably has a lot to do with the prevailing economic ideas, or the inadequacy of prevailing economic ideas to effectively address the kind of structural problems that the South African economy faced. And this continues to be an issue, and I want to just spend the rest of my time really sort of elaborating on this point. The challenges are great, our economic ideas are really quite inadequate at this point. So let me just actually share my screen. It'll be easier to, let's see if I can go to, are you seeing my screen? Can somebody give me a voice signal as to whether you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So this is a sort of a framework for thinking about different policies for creating an inclusive society that I've been using in other kind of contexts, but I think it's also useful frame for thinking about South Africa. So we can think about, sort of in this matrix, we can think about two dimensions around which we can organize our policies. The columns are sort of what stage of the economy we're intervening, whether it's in the pre-production, during the production, investment, employment, or innovation stages of the economy, or post-production. And then the rows are about sort of where in the income distribution we are targeting our interventions, whether it's the bottom poverty or targeting the middle or the middle classes or the very top of the income distribution. It might be easier to sort of to think about this in the context of real world examples. So kind of a modern advanced economy, I think sort of basically all of these cells are somehow filled. But the point is that different kinds of policies address different parts of the economy and different types of inequality. Now, I think in the South African case, to sort of abstract from a lot of other sort of from the detail, I think the key things, what was really distinctive about, I think, the South African policies after 1994 were first the effort at bringing up the floor, the bottom, and that was partly through sort of higher floor on wages, as COSATU and the labor unions became much more effective. Labor market policies and high wage policies effectively raised the floor. But of course, that also had meant that not enough employment at the low end could be created. So there was a complementary set of policies, social transfers, which became very generous. And these are post-production because they sort of redistribute after production and employment decisions have taken place. And as the paper summarizes, I think these policies were largely effective in terms of reducing poverty and bringing the floor up. The other main thing, I think, distinctive thing about the South African experience is really this Black economic empowerment policies, BEE. Of course, that has many different dimensions, but as the authors, in fact, summarized and discuss in their paper, it effectively served to provide opportunity only at the very top for Black South Africans. So effectively, it became a way of providing access to the productive apparatus for a relatively skilled and well-connected set of Black South African elites, and that's the sense. That's why it's here in that cell, at the top cell. I think the big missing part of the approach and the strategy is this middle cell, and this is what the authors refer to as sort of the need to create the economic opportunity, and the fact that the middle class remained very small. Now, I think here this is absolutely the crux of the South African problem. But it reflects a very serious and deep economic problem that the democratic regime inherited in 1994. And this problem is essentially a mismatch between what South Africa produces and what South Africa's labor factor endowments are. So there's a incredible mismatch between the kinds of the specialization pattern of the South African economy and its labor and its factor endowments. Of course, this is an inheritance from the apartheid regime, because the apartheid economic regime was effectively built around providing economic opportunities for on the whole, skilled and well-educated white minority. So what we get is essentially a production structure that is highly biased towards skill-intensive sectors, finance, other skill-intensive services, even manufacturing was relatively capital-intensive, while the labor force, the endowments of the economy are highly unskilled, very poor training and skill and education levels. So this is essentially the fundamental problem that the economic strategy had to deal with and failed to. And I think, again, the economic strategy was not at all a complete failure. Like I'm saying this is a disappointment. It was a success to the extent that it prevented significant macro imbalances, but was able to do very little to alter the production structure and therefore ultimately deal with this mismatch. So what would not have worked, and in fact did not work, was essentially a lot of things that played into the existing pattern of specialization and comparative advantage of the South African economy, which, however, did not address this fundamental structural problem. So policies that try to increase the profitability and investment incentives in the skill-intensive, most productive, most competitive parts of the economy, essentially, even to the extent that they were successful, would only worsen the mismatch, widen further, and do very little to increase the youth and unskilled employment. Similarly, a strategy that essentially tries to turn the South African economy towards the world economy, attract more foreign investment, chains, boost it doesn't do very much for this fundamental structural mismatch because those most competitive parts of the economy are in fact in the skill-intensive parts of the economy. Now, logically, there are really only three ways that we could address this mismatch. One was to increase the skills of the labor force. But this works only in the long run at best. So it was neither a solution in the short run nor in the medium run. Second, again, logically, reduce the skill intensity of the existing production. In other words, retain your existing structural production, but change production techniques and technology. This is very, very difficult in light of technological realities. That you cannot simply change your technology. What's available in terms of technology in different sectors is given on world markets. And again, logically, the only thing that's left is to stimulate the production of labor-intensive structure, fundamental structural change, but in a way that we don't actually associate with development, because in some ways it would be a kind of a reverse structural transformation, developing sectors where labor productivity and TFP were actually lower than in the most competitive parts of the economy, but getting the employment generating benefits of that. So we don't necessarily know if this would have worked, but and precisely because it poses such difficult challenges to economic policy and takes us into such unrecognized and sort of new terrain. I think that it's not entirely clear how you would have proceeded on that and how it would be. So I think that last strategy is still essentially what the government has to invest a lot more in. Brian mentioned that that there is sort of expansion of public employment schemes. That's 1 million people sounds a lot, but that's 5% of the labor force in an economy where a third of the labor force is unemployed, but has to go beyond just simply public services. It has to really become sort of be productive employment, but it'll be productive employment of a very different kind. Small and medium-sized enterprises, services, those kinds of things that we don't necessarily associate with when we think about industrial policy or generating a greater competitiveness. And frankly, we don't actually know a lot about how to do it. So it is. So I think I say that it's the economic disappointments are partly, or at least largely, related to sort of our own conceptions about economic ideas and what had to do. Unfortunately, South Africa did not have a lot of help from economists and economic sort of policymakers in terms of thinking through some of these challenges. And I think those still plague. Going back to the importance of ideas, I think the kind of damaging ideas of identity politics and ethnopopulism find greater room for themselves when our good ideas about how to generate mobility and jobs and equity and inclusion aren't working. So I think that's the fundamental challenge for us to come up with the right kinds of ideas so that we can crowd out the bad ideas. And so we need to remain hopeful on that. So let me stop here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Danny, for explaining how there's a mismatch in the economy between the production structure and the labor force, and how certain policies have aggravated the situation, and certain principles that need to be kept in mind in trying to address this imbalance. So now I'm going to hand over to Trudy for her own remarks. Trudy, you have around 10 to 12 minutes. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Zainab. And good afternoon. It's afternoon in my end of the world to everyone. So let me begin by saying, I think as most of us, in this audience would be aware, there have been many analyses and reviews on South Africa's post-apartheid economic performance, including those undertaken by the National Planning Commission and the Comprehensive High-Level Panel on the Assessment of Legislation and the Acceleration of Fundamental Change that was commissioned by Parliament a few years ago. They all attest to the gap between the promise of our Constitution and the lived reality of most South Africans. The World Bank also produced a strong review titled An Incomplete Transition: Overcoming the Legacy of Exclusion in South Africa around 2018. Though today's paper is focused more on the political economy and the institutional aspects of the South African situation, it reminds me of the World Bank diagnostic. To quote the abstract of that paper, it says, the first three clauses of the Freedom Charter, the historic 1955 document setting out the central objectives of the democratic movement, were the people shall govern, all national groups shall have equal rights, and the people shall share in the country's wealth. While the first two objectives have largely been achieved since the first democratic elections of 1994, I think what Danny also talks about as the political success, historical disadvantage remains a determinant of income, wealth, opportunity, notwithstanding some progress. As such, the economic transition from a system of exclusion under segregation and apartheid remains incomplete. As the authors put it in this paper, today's paper, South Africa's inherited extreme inequalities were addressed only at the margins. I think this theme of incompleteness should not surprise us, given that we're just one generation into the post-apartheid era. South Africa is also deeper than just a case of democratization. What we experienced in the 1990s was essentially the fall of the last regime, formally and explicitly premised on racial segregation and anti-Blackness. And we should learn from the American experience. The economic promise after the Civil War and liberation of enslaved people, the abandoned 40 acres and a mule land reform attempt, and a long period of persistent economic exclusion that resonates to this day. The path from a segregationist regime to inclusive prosperity is not one to be underestimated. We also see in the American case that Black people's economic stagnation and decline can sometimes be read as a reflection of perceived deficits within that community, without a reference to what should be obvious, the reproduction of entrenched disadvantage over generations. Instead of a focus on completing the transition, so to speak, there's often the characterization of Black liberatory politics as identity politics. which is then accompanied by a fruitless preoccupation with Black anger and activism and how it's expressed. So with this in mind, I approach the topic of ethnopopulism with a lot of trepidation, given that context. We should also not forget that in South Africa, the early responses to the rupture represented by the Polokwane moment, which ushered in the Zuma era, was the formation of a political party like COPE, the Congress of the People, which was quite broad-based and quite neutral, if one would say, in terms of a framing around identity. You may argue that this was not a successful endeavor, but it reminds us that there has always been a constant attempt to build an inclusive politics. Today's paper discusses the EFF and also certain variants and tendencies within the ANC. And I think the EFF, indeed, in its early days, could be seen in the ethnopopulist mode. But increasingly more prominent in its discourse is a very classic Western left ideology, sometimes peppered with a bit of fanon. Interestingly, it has also taken an anti-populist stance against Afrophobia and xenophobia. A lot of economic disillusion is expressed through xenophobia, but the EFF has been very clear in standing in support of immigrants. So that's been an interesting trajectory in that rhetoric. What I thought I would see, in addition to what is already in the paper, is a reflection on some of the more typically ethnopopulist movements and parties that one can think of through South Africa's recent history. You can think of the 1990s Inkatha Freedom Party, the post-Maimane Democratic Alliance, the Freedom Front at all times, the business forums that disrupt construction sites, AfriForum, which mobilizes almost exclusively on ethnicity, and those kinds of movements. I do fully agree with one of the central arguments in the paper, that ideas matter. You know, you say a hopeful vision of change, when combined with a good enough response to distributional concerns, can be sufficient to launch a positive trajectory. One of our challenges, of course, in the current moment is the resurrection of dormant narratives. For example, what you call the catastrophizing narrative of public service cannot be divorced from the prejudices and the narrative apparatus of our oppressive past. Biko, whom you quote in another part of the paper, would have no trouble understanding today why even Black people participate in this catastrophizing narrative. We have to rebuild the state so that it plays its rightful role in growth and development. President Ramaphosa has placed rebuilding state capacity as a top priority, the #1 priority. A few weeks ago, in his capacity as the chief lifelong learner in government, he attended a seminar led by Professor Mariana Matsukatu at our National School of Government. An important idea in that seminar was that an effective, dare we say, an entrepreneurial state should work out to set the agenda for development and should work and guide the private sector towards that agenda. A weak state simply cannot drive society towards its goals. In recent times, we have seen the trimming of our cabinets and government departments. We've seen inspirational appointments in some SOEs and in key government departments. We've seen the development of a policy paper towards the professionalization of the public service, which would also change power relations in terms of who senior leaders in the public service report to. Structural reform is being driven through a new partnership between the presidency and National Treasury, dubbed Operation Vulindlela, which has scored some early successes in helping departments to adopt an agenda of changing the way they do things, but also changing policy positions on areas such as energy reform and skilled immigration, for example. So what is the way forward? The paper argues that President Ramaphosa has taken a legalistic and incremental path to reform, and that path is reliant on weak institutions. I did find this very surprising in a paper that would seem to align itself with the rebuilding of institutions, and which argues that ideas matter. In the febrile, contested arena that is South African politics, one would think that a reform process that is not hinged on due process, careful due process, and the rule of law would perpetuate the wrong kinds of ideas, the ideas that we're trying to get away from. And so, ultimately, we need to get back on the path towards a post-pandemic recovery and a reconstruction that really speaks to inclusive growth. We have to break the grip of private and public monopoly and high barriers to entry into the economy. We also have to increase the productive capacity of the economy. And I think this is the aspiration that is clearly articulated in the economic recovery and reconstruction plan. Because if we don't do that, we will be building upward mobility on a crumbling staircase. We need to rethink the fundamentals of the economy and where we have slid in terms of our global share of the export market, in terms of our productivity. The only way that we can regain some of that lost ground is through the active participation of all citizens. I can't say I've always internalized what Danny has to say about reverse structural transformation, but it is clear that the structure of our economy is not going to work. You can't simply take her at the edges in terms of trying to create job creation at a sustainable level. And so that is an important agenda for the government, even though I suppose we might still be thinking about it in terms of raising productivity. Finally, to round up, I must say, I think, even as we look at issues such as the green transition, the just transition, it becomes important that we focus on the kinds of bargains that are being struck. So if you look at the South African case, we've been pioneering in introducing renewable energy into our energy mix. We've made a clear commitment to the Paris Agreement. But in recent times, there's been massive contestation on what a green economy means. There's been great suspicion around that transition. And at the heart of it, I think it's about the bargains that are being struck. Are the losers feeling sufficiently compensated by those who are on the winning side of the green transition? And inevitably in South Africa, it immediately takes on a racial undercurrent. And so I think we need to build hopeful narratives that actually show that as we work towards a new economy, we're going to have to build back better, but we also have to build back together. And that, I think, as the paper very convincingly argues, comes with a credible commitment to inclusivity and a credible commitment to mobility for those who've been excluded. So thank you very much, and well done to the authors.
Thank you so much, Trudy, for providing that important context on, the legacy of historical disadvantage, on how ethnopopulism itself is, shaping up and evolving, the role of the EFF and how, their narratives and their narratives have actually evolved, from just ethnopopulism to adopting more of the language of Western leftist discourse, and your clear ideas about the need to rebuild the state, and what can be done in terms of the way forward to break the grip of public and private monopoly, to build productive capacity. And very, very importantly, I think I really like your final concluding point on the green economy and the just transition as a new sphere of contestation, right? A lot of these historical legacies of inequalities could actually, or might actually be playing out in the green economy, and the discussions and policies and efforts around around the climate transition, in a sense. So we're gonna hand over now to Alan Hirsch to respond to these remarks from Danny and from Trudy. So we're running a bit out of time, but I hope Alan can provide his responses in the next 5 minutes or so. Thank you. I think you're muted, Alan.
Thank you very much, Zainab. It's great to have an Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment, and wonderful that you're running it. And thank you for this opportunity. I obviously cannot do justice to these two really, really thoughtful comments on our paper in 5 minutes. So, just as we could do justice to the story, I think, full justice to the story in our paper, it's a stylized kind of history. It's a caricatured history in many ways, because we're trying to pursue an argument. So there is a lot of subtlety in the story that we have left out. And I think that Trudy has pointed out very well. I mean, I'm trained as an historian as much as I've been trained as an economist. And, everything Trudy says, makes me feel, we should have done this and we should have done that. Clearly, the internalization of inequality, the persistence of inequality, the persistence of identity in the reality of society, and the widespread nature of identity politics in South Africa, some of it used for ethno-populist mobilization, is a real challenge. And the way that President Ramaphosa and his government have approached the reform clearly shows the fundamental resistance that they are trying to put up against that kind of characterization of our society, and that those kinds of opportunities for mobilization. So it's true that the legalism and incrementalism in the approach of the president and the current government is something in which, in a way you could contrast it, with some of the anti-corruption policies that have been adopted in other African countries where, perhaps don't have to mention the specifics, but there are a number of fairly obvious examples in recent times and in the past where anti-corruption policies have been used to destroy opponents rather than to change the nature of society. And it's a well-made point by Trudy, and I appreciate it. And she made a lot of good points. I think the point about structural transformation links up with something that Danny said, and I think that that's very important. I do think, and Trudy's background is in the economics of industrial structure, and she's worked in that area, and she knows the problems that we face very well, the imbalance of power between big business and small business, and also between the monopolies, as Bernard echoed, in the state and in the private sector, or the virtual monopolies or oligopolies in the private sector, which have limited the possibility for the emergence of a number of different types of competitive and relatively more labor-intensive types of business from emerging. So it is a critical issue. Just to briefly talk about to Danny's points. Yes, economic failure, political success, but I guess we're positing that there may be a relationship between the economic failure and the political success. Was the political success based on on shifting sands, on a series of commitments that were really, really difficult to fulfill? Was the political settlement based on almost impossible promises? Perhaps, just to put it crudely, and I've argued this elsewhere, the incoming ANC government didn't undertake the kind of radical reforms that it might have under different circumstances, because it was trying to rebuild a society that was very fragmented. So it was hampered, significantly hampered. And I think that ultimately undermined some of the capacity for the kind of significant shift in economic policy that was needed. I think that kind of conversation was beginning to happen in government, in the period before the global financial crisis. Danny and a team of international researchers was engaged in that conversation. Unfortunately, that conversation was cut short by the sort of dramatic political transformation or transitions of the 2007-2008 in South Africa. I think that his point about the importance of labor-intensive businesses and the opportunities for labor-intensive businesses in South Africa remains very, very important. And it's very obvious where those areas are. There's a lot of potential in agriculture that hasn't been fulfilled, and there's some really exciting developments in agriculture in South Africa. Tourism, hospitality, other services are really, really big opportunities for labor-intensive development, perhaps in the manufacturing sector too, but there's so much competition in those sectors from other parts of Africa and the East in particular that makes that very difficult. I suppose my final question, and it's a question maybe I've posed to Danny before, is it a choice? Is it a choice between labor-intensive and high-skilled industries, or is there a possibility of pushing both? Because traditionally South Africa has had some competitive advantages in the world, but particularly in Africa, in areas which are relatively skill-intensive. And in my view, it's not impossible to drive a policy which is both supporting the sort of higher value labor-intensive industries which are emerging in South Africa, and the still higher value more capital and more skill-intensive businesses which South Africa has traditionally been relatively strong in. But thank you very much to the commentators. There's lots more food for thought, and I hope that this conversation will be able to be continued. So, Zainab, I wonder how we do that. Thank you.
Excellent. I think that's a very, very valid question. And certainly at Carnegie Africa, we want to provide that platform to have some of these discussions on specific countries like South Africa, but also taking, kind of sub-regional, a regional, and even a continental approach. Because as you, Brian, Vino, and Musa were all presenting key findings of the report, I kept thinking about other African countries where certainly the contexts are very, very different, but there are also a lot of parallels, whether it's high unemployment, whether it's absence of labor-intensive production activities, whether it's just the challenge of structural economic transformation, or, more broadly, the absence of a unifying and cohesive national vision. So there are certain, parallels with other countries, and certainly those are some of the trends, the issues, and the dynamics that we do want to address and examine here at the Africa program at Carnegie. So now I think we're going to have everyone back on screen, and then we will take a couple of questions. And a reminder to our audience to please send us your questions, via YouTube or even on Twitter. My colleagues are scanning Twitter to see what questions have come in. And we have about 3 or 4 so far. I'm going to pose them to our speakers and discussants. And I have a few myself. So here's the first one from Alina Menokal. What are the most salient fault lines of conflict in South Africa now? And what is the role of ethnicity in that? So let me quickly mention that we were initially scheduled to conclude at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, but we're going to extend this for another 10 minutes to 11:40 so we can really get to some of the burning questions that people have and to have a more rich conversation. So that's the first question. And maybe I'm going to pose like 2 or 3. We'll have a discussion on those, and then we'll see which other ones come in. The second question is, what is the current status between the GDP of South Africa and the alliance with the United States? My interpretation of that question is broadly, what is the relationship, between the United States and Africa and South Africa? And then the third question is, it seems that a political economic issue is dealt purely as an economic issue. the continuity of comparative advantage between groups will keep increasing without addressing that unequal arrangement. So here are the three questions. Maybe I'll hand over to Brian and then he can, hand over to his colleagues. Thanks.
Thanks, Zainab. Let me make three responses to those questions and then ask Vino and Musa if they'd like to add. First, and this responds to two of the questions, I think one theme that is central is that South Africa essentially has only one positive way forward, which is inclusive, vibrant transformation. Anything that does not achieve that will, Danny in his comments flagged the remarkable political success. The backdrop of that remarkable political success is high risk. And unless that inclusive, vibrant transformation is central and is the focus, that high risk looms large. Second, linked to that and linked to another one of the questions, I think one of the central arguments that we make is that this is fundamentally an issue of public leadership. And the dilemma that we have, it's partly technical, but it's more than technical and ideational, is that technically, the technical narratives we have on good policy are not responsive to the challenge that South Africa confronts right now. Ideationally, what comes to mind when you have this, I think back to the 1930s in the United States, FDR, moment of crisis, bold, persistent experimentation. There's a galvanizing energy associated with how do you respond to a crisis. And insofar as one responds to a crisis technocratically, and I'm mindful of Trudy Makaya's comment, but insofar as the response is only technocratic, it's not going to have the turnaround impact that we need. Where does that kind of leadership is something we've been trying to explore in the Mandela School, but how does one shift the narrative from a technocratic to that? And finally, and linked to that, the questions that arose around state capacity. State capacity is key. It's an area I've done quite a lot of work in many settings. But the dilemma that we confront, which I think is fairly extreme in the South Africa case, is a narrative of state capacity as government should deliver. And I think, as was repeatedly flagged, and as I think there's an opportunity, which is an unrealized opportunity in the South Africa case, that an effective state is also a state that engages in a positive, creative way the active energy and the active participation of its citizens. And a technocratic narrative combined with a narrative around state capacity once again leaves out that crucial galvanizing element. So I will pause there and see if Vino or Musa want to add on some of the others.
Any additions?
Anything there.
Okay.
Sorry, Zainab. Nothing to add from me on that first question. Thank you.
Musa?
I'm just going to add broadly on some of the questions that you raised, Zainab, that involve questions of informality and participation. And I think that to some extent it might just cover the question around political economy versus economic issues. I think that it is something that we have underexplored in South Africa. We know that we have a largely bifurcated economy where we have, in a way, a first world economy and a third world economy. And you have this missing middle where informality has not been encouraged. And indeed, I think that we've had laws that have punished informality. And I think that that kind of thinking is one of the ideas that we need to let go of, because there needs to be some dynamism that is exploratory, that is characteristic of the life and dynamism of developing countries. And I think that we are sitting in a very uncomfortable space there on the potential of informality and indeed the inclusion of youth, as you've raised, Zainab. And I think that then moving on to the question around, whether we're dealing with political economy questions just using, the economic lens, I think that is incomplete, because in our paper we make it very clear that we are cognizant of the configuration of power and the role of ideas which are embedded in the distribution of power and how power reproduces itself. And so I think that we do have an inclusive way of dealing with this. And, you know, what is the fine line between political economy versus economy? I think that we do try to tackle it from all points. I think that's it on my side. Thanks, Zaina.
Great. So the next is, okay, sorry, Trudy wants to come in.
Maybe just a quick one. I mean, I think I was intrigued by that point about state capacity always being cast as government must deliver. And I think that is one thing that the president has tried to drive in terms of social compacting around various areas, including the energy transition, including on the recovery plan. I think what we still have, though, that's a bit of a barrier to that is that this idea of mistrust between the state and the private sector, particularly established business. And I think we're getting over that. So, I mean, I think it shouldn't be lost that we, certainly in government, the idea of a social compact and bringing all of society together is one that is very much alive. Thanks.
Great. So our next and probably final set of questions, there are two of them. The first is from Malcolm LV. He's asking, is there a leadership school that can implant some of these ideas? So let me actually add to that. Because as Danny in particular was speaking towards the end, I kept thinking to myself, what should these new ideas be like? And I asked this question because we're at a time when, you know, the predominant thinking around economic management, economic development, which was informed by Washington consensus orientation, is, you know, a lot of people are questioning that right now. And if you look at also how a lot of governments have responded to the economic disruption of COVID-19, they've taken to put it lightly, a very Keynesian approach of high levels of government spending and intervention. So we're at a time when a lot of predominant ideas are all up in the air. And you have a situation where in South Africa, and perhaps Southern Africa more broadly, given the historical legacies, the role of liberation movements, economic management has tended to be kind of more maybe left-leaning compared to what you would find in West Africa, you know, whether it's Nigeria or even East Africa like Kenya. So what should these ideas look like? And, you know, then how can these ideas, once there's some consensus around them, how can they be disseminated among key actors, key constituents, key groups? So sorry, that's a very convoluted question, but question number one. Then the second question that has come in is, what would you say is essential would you say that it is essential to involve the average citizen in understanding and educating the depths of potentially taking on inclusive growth development in South Africa? So basically involving the average citizen in these discourses and in these narratives. So maybe Danny, Trudy can also come in, and then all of the others.
Can I come in on the leadership question? On the leadership school question?
Sure.
Zainab, yeah. I think that question speaks to something I flagged, which was this this increasingly problematic politicization that we've seen in the public sector, which hasn't been solved by sort of a supply side solution, which is let's just create leadership schools and programs, and that is it's a supply driven way of building capacity in a state bureaucracy which has been undermined consistently by political interference. And so, we've had lots of leadership schools. The latest incarnation is the National School of Government. We've had several previous iterations of leadership schools in government. We have leadership schools in academia. But, apart from, formal, sort of the delivery of formal professional skills and credentials to senior public servants, the question is, what impact have those interventions have when you're trying to solve what is fundamentally a political problem with a technocratic solution, which is let's build a leadership school and train up public servants to rebuild that trust that Trudy talked about and develop technical skills to manage the economy and improve public services. So I think the problem isn't so much the lack of these schools, because there are programs and institutions which are designed to build formal capacity amongst public servants, but it can't solve the root cause of politicization, which really emanates from political parties and the ANC in particular. And how do you, if you're gonna keep a policy like cadre deployment, is there any way to rehabilitate that into a form of politicization that is going to reduce the sort of the spoils-driven pressures and have a kind of politicization which is really very much limited and focused on policy control, which many other countries have been able to manage.
So, Zainab, do you mind if I respond as well on that?
Sure.
So as the founding director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, I think I kind of have to respond because Faisal isn't on the screen now. Firstly, we don't think that officials, especially the sort of senior officials that we work with and the people who have the potential to be senior officials, are necessarily going to be able to change the political world. So the first thing that we teach them is to understand that political world and to make the best possible progress that they can within that political world. So that's half of what we do. And I think the National School of Government, is being rebuilt. I think the School of Government at Wits University is another important one, and there are several. So, but what we try to do especially is to help people understand the context in which they work and to be effective within that context. And then we also do build values. I mean, Faisal made that point in his introductory remarks. We do try to, we have leadership programs with political leadership as well as leaders amongst the bureaucracy. And we do try to find ways for people to understand why, the kind of ethical basis of good governance and to help them to, for a long period in South Africa during the Zuma period, we were acting as counselors. We were counselors to people in a really broken system, helping them to make the kind of personal decisions that they had to make during that period, which was very difficult, but I think that we could play some kind of a role there. There were a few other questions that haven't been answered. The question of engaging with every citizen, I think that's exactly what Brian meant when he's talking about ideational. It's something that, it's a whole of society thing. It's not only amongst elites. The whole of society must understand where we are going. And I do think President Ramaphosa has made an effort to do that. His public communication is pretty good, but there's more work that can be done in that area. There was a question about the US-South Africa relationship. In terms of trade and politics, our major relationships are with Africa, with Europe, and with Asia, particularly India and China. The United States is also a very important trading and investment partner, and AGOA has been an important relationship issue for us. I think that we didn't have an ambassador for 3/4 of the Trump presidency, which seemed to suggest to us that we didn't have a high priority on the agenda of government then, and we hope that we will have a higher priority going forward. Thanks, Zainab.
Great. We're running out of time. Okay, Trudy, if you can respond in 30 seconds.
I was just going to make the quick point that, we talk about how we need to move away from the Washington consensus, from technocracy, etc. But the global system of rewards and reprisals still works along those lines. So, we always have looming the surveillance of the international organization, the ratings of credit rating agencies. That's it. It goes on and on and on. The views of foreign investors. And I think they still see the sticks and carrots are still in that world. So it becomes very difficult to think about what is the zone of transformation that you can move in that doesn't attract that kind of unwarranted attention. Thanks.
Great. I would really have loved to hear from Professor Roderick, but he has kind of escaped this time around. But yes, we have actually run out of time, but this has been such a fascinating discussion. Certainly, we're going to follow up on some of the key things that have been raised in this presentation, in this session, over the next coming weeks and months. So thank you very much to everyone here. Fascinating discussions, to the authors, Brian, Musa, Vino, Alan, and the director of the Mandela School of Public Service, Public Governance, Faisal Ismail, for joining us. Then to Trudy as well as to Danny Roderick. And thank you to the interim president of Carnegie for joining us today. Well, have a nice day, everyone, and we'll be in touch.